It's grand to be welcoming you once again, first time in 2021, to the Working Class Movement Library and our series of Invisible Histories talks. And we welcome particularly our speaker today, Paul Fitzgerald, aka political cartoonist Polyp, and he is going to talk to us about his forthcoming graphic novel on the topic of Thomas Paine.
All right, fantastic. Okay, so really appreciate being invited to do this by Working Class Movement Library, and really grateful to see so many of you here. So who I am very briefly is I've been a political cartoonist for the last 30 years, probably more, working for people like New Internationalists, lots of different campaign groups. I'm showing this one in particular because it's perhaps my most famous piece. It's been all around the world, obviously about the economic exploitation of Africa. Another real bestseller is this one, which I created as being part of the anti-consumerism movement and Buy Nothing Day and all that sort of stuff. I don't know if anybody remembers that from the 90s. Yeah, this one really did the rounds. So this one's from a skeptics project I did. I'm very interested in the whole relationship between skeptical, critical thinking and political views and the way in which society makes decisions, which is obviously something very relevant to Paine. So this one's basically about the denial of facts that's part of so much political misunderstanding. So having done all these little single panel cartoons, I started drifting into doing graphic novels. This is one of the center page spreads from a book I did called Speechless or Sprachlos in the German version. But oddly enough, it was a history of the world without any words in it. It was my real first venture into talking about the past. I was kind of inspired by one of the really early round robin emails that used to do the rounds, which talked about if the world was 100 people. It was one of those sort of perspective things about like, what does the world look like if you step back from it? And this book was very much about that. And I used this kind of almost hieroglyphic language for the characters. I kind of wanted the reader to have the experience of almost watching a miniature world through a microscope, but also being, if you like, a neutral alien observer, watching these figures running around and what they do over the centuries. So that was my first venture into history. I then did one about the history of the cooperative movement, which was absolutely fascinating. This was for one of the anniversaries in 2012, year of cooperation. And that covered the story of the Rochdale pioneers and very much like what the roots of the movement were. I had a whole chapter about the science of cooperation in nature. So, you know, very much sort of history, science themes coming out in my work. And then, of course, some of you will probably be aware of the graphic novel I did of Peterloo, which was, yeah, probably the most ambitious thing I've done to date. This was done in a style I'll talk about a little bit later on, where I didn't write any fictional dialogue. Everything was just quotes from the time. And this very kind of, perhaps you could call it a photorealistic approach to telling the story. This took weeks to draw. That crowd scenes like that are absolutely a lot of hard work. But I was very pleased that it ended up as an 8-foot-long mural in the Abercrombie pub. You know, the Abercrombie pub here in Manchester that's very much associated with the Peterloo Massacre. I thought that was a fantastic bit of outreach. So that's very quickly who I am. And this, of course, is the book, Tom Paine's Bones. I think some of you are going to be familiar with the song that inspired the title. People may or may not be aware of the whole idea that Paine's bones were dug up from America and transported to England, which I'll talk about a little bit later on. But I like this as a title in the idea that Paine's body was scattered in the way that his ideas were scattered around the world. I think it's got a lot of symbolic value. So I'm really pleased with it as a nice, snappy title. And as you see, the subtitle is a fantastical visual biography, which I'll talk about a little bit later on as well. So my main motivation for writing about Paine is I've always been attracted to history that's not well known. In fact, I've always been attracted to any facts or incidents that aren't well known. I think what a culture forgets is perhaps as telling as what it remembers, and why it forgets, I think, is a really interesting theme. So yeah, I'm one of those people who wants to know what's in the box and wants to lift up the rock and see what's under it. And so anytime I hear that there's a high impact event or figure who's been forgotten, I want to know why. And there's usually some very interesting political reasons for that. But what's interesting about Paine being forgotten, you know, like, obviously I tell a lot of my friends and colleagues what I'm working on. And you can see they feel a little bit guilty about not knowing who Paine is, you know. When I sort of say to people, I'm doing this biography of Tom Paine, do you know who he is? It always elicits this kind of slightly guilty response, but then, which I think is inappropriate. It's not their fault that they've forgotten about him. But he's also on the tip of everyone's memory, if you like. He sounds so familiar. I think that's one of the most interesting things about him. And I think that reflects two things. I think that there is this underground recognition of him in the woodwork, whatever metaphor you want to use. But I also think that a great political writer, when you read their words for the first time, they automatically feel familiar. It's like you've known what they're saying for a long time because it's profoundly true. And it feels almost like one of your own thoughts, if people understand what I'm getting at. So I thought, you know, this one is perhaps the most famous. These are the times that try men's souls. I'll talk about the politics of this a little bit later and how different people of different political views around the world react to this. But that's, I think, one of Paine's most famous quotes. I think his other really interesting one is, "My country is the world and my religion is to do good." That makes him a classic do-gooder, but I think that's not necessarily a bad thing. I think that one is amazing. That you know, I think that's in the back of people's memories. They don't know where they've heard it, but they know they've heard it from somewhere. One that's been really, really relevant recently, and I've been posting a lot around the sort of MAGA, I don't know what you want to call it, movement, rebellion, delusion around the world, is that those who abuse liberty when they possess it would abuse power if they could obtain it. I've had lots of fun creating memes with pictures of all those guys with machine guns hanging around outside city halls in America. And again, but I think perhaps another contester for the best known Paine quote is, "We have it in our power to begin the world again." And one of the big ironies about why that is so well known is Reagan said it about the political situation when he was around. So it's really interesting that it's not always from left sources that people are familiar with Paine. So I'm going to do a really quick potted biography of him. There's no way I can go into in any kind of detail with the time we've got available, but obviously a transatlantic figure. You know, he started off in England, born in Thetford, became, if you like, kind of bored and disillusioned with his life in England, and met Benjamin Franklin in London, who wrote one of those lovely things, which is probably the Facebook of its era, which was a letter of introduction that enabled Paine to travel over to America and just begin introducing himself to people when he got there. Then, of course, he made it, having written an amazing book called Common Sense, which many people regard as galvanizing the American War of Independence. People forget that there wasn't necessarily that much enthusiasm for a separation from England, a rebellion, and lots of the famous historical figures we associate with the American Revolution attribute to Paine the fact that it changed a lot of people's minds and galvanized that, well, basically what was a liberation movement, a revolution. So that was his book Common Sense, which is another absolutely fantastic title. Apparently he wanted to call it Plain Truth, which I think is quite interesting, given that you see those people on the street corner, don't you, trying to sell you plain truth. I'm trying to remember who they are. Which church is it that sells that one? I've forgotten. They're quite a strange sect anyway. But yeah, eventually ended up being called Common Sense. So of course, Paine then makes his way to France. He writes his next book, The Rights of Man, in defense of the revolution that had begun there. But but his life story is just an amazing series of scrapes with death. I can't begin to list them all. His life story is almost comical in just how dramatic it is. It feels very, very fictional. This is one incident where I think it's very telling of how unstable the French Revolution was, and the stories about like mob violence were actually true. I mean, it wasn't a simple, clean revolution. There were lots of acts of brutality that were perpetrated by those who supported the revolution. And Paine went out one day without his hat and without his cockade. And this meant that the mob started identifying him as an aristocrat. And he very, very, very narrowly escaped being hung from a lamppost. It just happened to be that a friend who spoke French walked by at the same time. Absolutely amazing that he got away with that. That was really extraordinary. He would have disappeared from history on the turn of a dime. It would have been so easy for it to have gone differently. Okay, so it wasn't just mobs in the street that he fell out with. I mean, one of the things that's so fascinating about his story is his involvement in the French Revolution, and just how classic a tale it is as well of an initially extremely positive thing turning dark for various political reasons. And Paine actually fell out with Robespierre and his faction, simply because he defended the king against execution. He said, no, if we're going to begin this new world, we're going to begin this new political system, let's not begin it by spilling blood. And because he spoke out against the execution of the king, he ended up in jail himself and threatened with the guillotine. And there we have his second insane scrape with death. He's in jail in an old luxury hotel called Luxembourg, which got converted into a jail, which is going to be a very bizarre thing to draw. I can't quite imagine what a luxury hotel that's rapidly being converted into a prison for people on their way to the guillotine would look like, but I'll keep hunting. But yeah, his next scrape with death, and these are not the only ones, is that he was marked down for execution the next day. And the way in which that happened is the jailer would come round and mark the door with chalk if you were due to be sent to the guillotine the next day. Paine had a fever, and the door of his jail cell was wide open, so much so that it was flat against the external wall of the cell, so that when the mark was put on it and the door was shut again, the mark was on the inside. That is just one of those stories. Would you believe that if somebody put it in a movie? You know, absolutely insane. All of these moments of pure chance make for a fantastic story. It isn't just his politics and his ideas that are going to be a feature of the book. It's this incredible, ripping yarn that I want to explore. This is one of the most extraordinary things about his time in Luxembourg jail is he wrote perhaps his most infamous book while he was in prison, called The Age of Reason. And as you know, as a bit of a science fiction geek and a bit of a science fan, I was incredibly amused to read The Age of Reason. It's essentially an attack on organized religion by a man, Thomas Paine, who was himself quite religious. Lots of people think that Paine was this atheist scourge of religion. He wasn't. He was somebody who absolutely loathed establishment religion, and religion that claimed to have, I don't know what you would call it, kind of exclusive access to the word of God through some book or revelation, or through some individual who claimed that God was speaking to them. Paine rejected all of that in Age of Reason. But he also was something of a kind of a Neil deGrasse Tyson of his day, or a Carl Sagan of his day. In the Age of Reason also has an entire chunk of it devoted to just talking about astronomy and speculation about alien life. I was really, really surprised. Here's this guy in this luxury hotel that's been converted into a prison, waiting to go to the guillotine, and he's writing about whether there's life on other planets. and whether they're watching us. I thought that was just absolutely extraordinary. I'll touch on this a little bit later, but I'm not using a straightforward photojournalistic approach for this book. I did that for Peterloo, and I thought that was an appropriate thing to do, but it's such a fantastical story that I want a lot of the images to have a slightly dreamlike quality. Yeah. And this one illustrating Paine's ideas about worlds after worlds after worlds, watching our world and learning from watching our world. I illustrated this with an old engraving from an amazing astronomer called Thomas Wright of Derby, who was one of the first self-educated working class men to become a published astronomer. And this is an engraving from one of his books that said something similar, that assumed that there was life throughout the universe. So that's enough sci-fi for now, but I thought that was just fascinating that somebody could write something like this in prison, awaiting execution. Okay, his writings in Age of Reason sound perfectly reasonable to a modern atheist ear. As I say, he wasn't an atheist. He was actually a deist who believed that there was some kind of deity working in the background in the structure of the universe. But this book was his downfall, which again is just another absolutely fantastic theme, a really interesting aspect to the book. Not only was Paine vilified by the political authorities of his day for his political writings. I mean, the English government wanted him dead, you know. I mean, that's partly why he went to France, because he knew that he was going to be tried for seditious libel, which carried the death penalty. But Age of Reason kind of destroyed his reputation and his popularity. It was an absolute taboo and an absolute no-no to criticize established religion in Paine's time. It was an extraordinary act of intellectual bravery, I think, that he decided to do this and decided to go ahead and attack mainstream religion. I think it speaks of somebody who is willing to sacrifice his own reputation for the truth. Loads of people who previously supported him abandoned him, partly because of his religious views, partly because of his criticisms of George Washington, which was another absolute no-no at the time. But I think it's fascinating that if you like, he almost experienced cancel culture during and after his lifetime because of his religious views. And I think that's a very challenging thing to think about, that just dissenting from religious consensus meant that he was ostracized and vilified, not only by the government, but by loads of people who previously had supported him. And the whole story of it, like the phrase, well, you find out who your friends are under certain circumstances, Paine certainly did, because loads of people abandoned him. And the second half of the book is, well, the last quarter of the book is actually quite sad, because he descended into poverty. He'd never made any money from his writings. He was one of the best-selling authors of the era. His books just sold left, right, and center, despite the government's attempt to suppress them. But he ended up in poverty and very much being passed from boarding house to boarding house before his death. I'll very quickly read you some of his quotes from Age of Reason. And again, partly because there's this whole thing of how modern he sounds. If I told you that this was Richard Dawkins, this next quote, I think you'd probably believe me. It's those who most believe the Bible are those who know least about it. Now that doesn't sound like somebody from 200 years ago, but it's Thomas Paine. It's fascinating that he sounds like a modern atheist despite his religious views. He also says, you believe in the Bible from the accident of birth, and the Turk believes in the Quran from the same accident, and each calls the other infidel. Those are amazingly powerful statements from that era. But as I say, they pretty much cost him his reputation. He was living basically in what were the care homes of their day in New York, being passed from household to household, where you paid for the usually the woman of the household to look after you and to nurse you. And yeah, it's really tragic that he died surrounded by religious people, including his doctor, who are absolutely determined to make him recant. It was a big cultural theme at the time of people who defied religious consensus. There was always this desire to prove that they'd recanted on their deathbeds. I know Christopher Hitchens talked about that a lot because he was being harassed by evangelicals on his deathbed. Yeah, and Paine managed one last moment of defiance, because even his doctor was essentially interrogating him on his deathbed, being quite cruel, I think, by saying, this is your last moments on earth. You are a dying man. Will you accept Jesus Christ as your savior? And Paine's last defiant words were, I have no wish to believe on that subject. And then he passed away, which I think is an amazing final moment for an incredible hero. So we talked earlier about connections to Manchester and Salford. Paine was buried on his farm. 6 people attended his funeral. He was a massive hero of the American Revolution for a huge chunk of his life, and only 6 people were there to see him off, including two freed slaves who'd come to the area because they so respected Paine. They'd heard that he died in the papers and wanted to be there. That's going to be a very powerful moment, but he didn't rest there, as I'm sure loads of you know. The very, very strange English radical Cobbitt, William Cobbitt, who'd previously absolutely vilified Paine in his writings, suddenly converted and became a fan. And like a lot of fanatical converts, I think he lost some perspective and decided it was appropriate to go to America and to dig Paine's remains up, which is just quite an extraordinary thing to happen. I think Paine might have quite resented that as well. The whole sort of religious notion of your remains having great significance. I think he would have rejected that, but he didn't have a whole lot of choice. And his remains were brought back to England by Cobbitt. There was much surprise in Liverpool at the customs office as to what the hell was going on. They tried to bring, Cobbitt tried to bring Paine's bones to a meeting in Manchester. I gather there was this kind of like, it wasn't that unusual to bring somebody's bodily remains to a celebration dinner. Now, whether that involves propping them up on a chair, I don't know. I mean, it's just such a strange cultural shift that we wouldn't, at least in the West, we would never dream of doing that with a dead body. But he was refused entry into Manchester because this was 1819, the year of the Peterloo Massacre, the subject of my previous graphic novel. And yeah, they just wouldn't let him into the city. So the remains were taken down to London and then tragically disappeared. Like it was a bit of a farce. It's one of the reasons why I kind of feel a bit of disrespect for Cobbitt for what he did, because like he just didn't follow through. He thought that he could build this shrine to Paine and Paine would become this kind of focus of political rebellion. And of course, none of that happened, and the bones disappeared, the remains disappeared. There's various claims as to where they are. But amusingly, the very first time I ever came across the working class movement and walked the planks, amazing puppet of Tom Paine, which I hope some of you will have seen, the bicycle puppet. First time I ever came across that and heard that that they were working on Tom Paine was on the anniversary of Peterloo. I was leaving one of the Peterloo commemoration rallies, and yeah, there was this amazing vision of Tom Paine's bones cycling towards me, and I'd been thinking about doing the book about Paine for quite a while. So that was a very nice moment.
And serendipitous.
It was, yes. Well, a bit like all of Paine's escapes from execution and from death. So I'm going to keep going at a rapid speed now because I want to go to questions. Another Manchester link is that when the state organised hatred of Paine was at its peak, there were effigies of him burnt up and down the country. And this is one, this was actually a panel that was supposed to go in my Peterloo book, because I wanted to talk about Paine having influenced the Peterloo protesters, but there sadly wasn't space. We had to cut this one out. but it's a picture of an effigy of him being burnt on Deansgate. And we filmed the video that sadly we weren't able to bring up now. We filmed that in Didsbury at the location of another burning. So yeah, absolutely crazy that it became more popular to burn effigies of Tom Paine than to burn effigies of Guy Fawkes. Absolutely extraordinary state-organized hatred. But I won't give everything away now, but there were some quite interesting twists to a few of these burnings that you'll read about in the book when it's finished. Some of them are actually quite hilarious, the way in which people use them as opportunities to actually say something positive about Paine. Really, really interesting thing there. So as you've, this is a picture of Cobbitt himself. I think this was very much the inspiration for the Walk the Plank working class movement library puppet. This is his a cartoon from the era of his remains being transported across the Atlantic to England. I absolutely love these period cartoons. I think they're fascinating, and I tend to include redrawings, re-renderings of them as part of the narratives that I do, with some interesting twists, which you'll see in a moment. So yeah, I wanted to talk about what attracts me to Paine, and you know, what is it that, what are the themes I think of his life, and one of them that makes him a political hero for me is that he was interested in justice and democracy and liberty, but he was also one of the pioneers of popularizing science. He very, very much reminds me of Carl Sagan, who I hope you're all familiar with from a couple of decades ago. This was a man who you know, would engage with reality and would have no truck with people's delusions or their dogma. And he felt that science very much represented that. And he talks about it in an extremely positive way, which I think can be rare amongst radicals. It's quite unusual for modern radicals to have a very positive view of science, which I think is a great shame. And I think Paine represents that. But he also just talked about not necessarily the politics of science, but the internationalism of science, when he said, "Science, the partisan of no country, but the beneficent patroness of all, has liberally opened a temple where all may meet. The philosopher," in other words, scientist, that's the period term for scientists, "the philosopher of one country sees not an enemy in the philosopher of another. He takes his seat in the temple of science and asks not who sits beside him." I think that's a really beautiful quote about the unifying aspects of the scientific endeavor. So that really enormously attracts me to Paine. It makes him one of my great personal heroes, not just for his politics. So I talked a little bit earlier about the narrative technique that I'm going to use, same as in the Peterloo graphic novel, where there's no fictional words. The entire narrative is going to be constructed from period documents. So in a sense, I'm not writing the book, I'm just editing it. I've collected together as many authenticated quotes as I can find. It's been particularly useful to use some of the contemporary biographies of Paine, some of which were friendly and some of which were intensely hostile. The government paid for certain biographies of him to make sure they were hatchet jobs. If you can imagine having your biography written by your worst enemy and think what that experience must be like. But yeah, I think it's a really vivid narrative technique. And I think, you know, the experience of researching it and coming across all these quotes for the first time is quite an intense one. And I want the readers to have that experience raw. I don't want to mediate it for them. I don't want to put any political spin on it. I don't want to, well, I want a warts and all portrait of this hero, partly because I think if somebody can't survive a warts and all examination, maybe they shouldn't be a hero in the first place. We should accept that all of our heroes are flawed. But having said that, so I'm putting together this narrative, but it's not just the words that make it up. So here's a really interesting contemporary, contemporarily resonant moment from the book. This is shortly after the Declaration of Independence was first read in New York. And a group called the Sons of Liberty were so impassioned by this reading that they decided to tear down the gold-plated statue of George III that was in Bowling Green Park. There's very, very few actual written accounts of it, oddly enough. There's a few newspaper items and there's a few personal diaries, but there are illustrations of it. And, you know, it's not just words that are political sources when you're creating a graphic novel. The images can be as well. And I'm sure all of you have already noticed that the people actually pulling on the ropes well, no, I won't say African Americans, they were slaves at the time. But yeah, it's all African hands doing the pulling. And I think this is going to shock quite a lot of people, that the actual work of pulling down the statue was done by slaves. So these people who see themselves as political rebels, they see themselves as putting down tyranny, apparently they ordered their slaves to do the actual work. There are so many layers of resonance with contemporary events going on in this one image. I think it's fascinating. But it throws up the whole issue of what do you count as history? And how do you construct a historical narrative? Because the only evidence I've got that it was slaves who did the work is a contemporary illustration, which I'll let you absorb for a moment or two. So this is an engraving from Germany, and it's one of the, I think it's about the only contemporary illustration of the event. It's wildly inaccurate. The buildings are completely wrong. The statues is completely wrong, but then, you know, you couldn't just Google your visual references, could you, for what the statue looked like? If you were an artist at the time and you've got somebody cracking the whip for your deadline for your engraving, you're just going to draw what's in your imagination. But why did the person choose to show these kind of, again, slightly wrong slaves? I mean, it made the clothes look a little bit more like from the Indian subcontinent than from America. Again, perhaps this person didn't know what things looked like, but there must be some reason why this person chose to do that. There must have been some report circulating that we no longer have. And that's going to be my justification for drawing it this way. And I hope it's going to cause a lot of controversy. I hope it's going to make a lot of people angry. It already has online. I've already had people telling me, you're just making this up. You're just one of these lefties making things up. So yeah, I hope there's going to be quite a bit of provocation going on in the book. But I think it also makes you think about, like, how do we construct history? I was watching a documentary the other day about the reconstruction of very, very damaged historical objects and how much guesswork goes into them. History is fragments that we put together, and I think that's just fascinating, and that's partly why I want people to have the raw experience of just reading these quotes without any filtering from me, that what you're reading is real history with what I hope are extremely engaging visuals, and I hope this is a kind of a really challenging new way to tell stories. I mentioned very briefly that that the Peterloo book made for a very photojournalistic style. We thought it's such a solemn event, it needs to be done in a very straightforward way. But because Paine's life story is just so extraordinary, I want to bring in elements of fantasy into the visuals. I don't want to just do the thing of person walks into room, hands book to other person, leaves room. I want this to have a slightly more dreamlike quality, because, to some extent, the past is a kind of a dream that we're trying to recall. We don't have the full facts. And yeah, I'm almost like a movie style where there's lots of dream sequences. I wanted to play around with the imagery. So here's another scrape with death that Tom Paine had in his youth. He became what's called a privateer, which is a state-sanctioned pirate, and you're allowed to go and raid your enemy's ships. And the boat that he was due to join was commanded by Captain Death, and the boat was called the Terrible, and it left from Execution Dock in London, and Paine was due to be on it Now that's again just, or it's almost as unbelievable as the jail cell story. It's just, what the hell? So this is partly why I want to play around with images like this, and I'm sure you can see that this is rather than just a boat, it's a coffin with Thomas Paine's name on it. He was prevented from getting on the boat by his father at the last minute. So again, just an extraordinary turn of fate, and it's kind of it embodies the phrase "death ship" as well. Some people, when I showed them this, they thought it was about slavery, which might have been appropriate. Here's another another scrape with death. The book is full of them. The book is full of them. I've listened to some stirring sea shanties while drawing these. This is Paine on his way to France to pick up supplies for the American Revolution, and their boat just drifted into this field of icebergs in the middle of a storm. So I'm sure you can see, like, the whole idea of skulls constantly appearing throughout the book is going to be an interesting theme. Took loads of different pictures of icebergs to get this right, but some icebergs do actually look quite skull-like. Now here we get even more experimental. I showed you that drawing of Cobbitt transporting Paine's bones on the back of a dragon, an absolutely crazy period cartoon that I've re-rendered. But this, I don't know how people feel about what they're seeing here. This is one of Paine's quotes about, like, monarchy appears to be this amazing thing, full of pomp and splendor, but when you pull back the curtain and you see what's really inside it, it's quite absurd. Now, that immediately made me think of Wizard of Oz. And there are some people who claim that the writer of Wizard of Oz, Frank L. Baum, I think I'm pronouncing that correctly, must have read Paine's quote, because it's basically the story of the Wizard of Oz, isn't it? And I thought, well, I want to illustrate this, but how do I do this without being wildly anachronistic? So I've kind of rendered the movie scene as if it was drawn by Gilray, or one of the political cartoonists from Paine's era. So this is another example where history is going to be slightly out of joint in the book. The script is going to be absolutely bang on authentic. I guarantee you any quotes in it have been treble checked, but the visuals are going to be very playful and explore things in a way that's going to be perhaps slightly hallucinogenic, in that how can this possibly be referring to a movie from more than 100 years later on. Some of them are going to be slightly more subtle. I don't know if people recognize what the reference here is. This is obviously American Gothic, the famous painting. This is a passage about Paine's very unhappy second marriage, sorry. And again, I want there to be these little visual resonances going on, even while the script is being extremely authentic and serious. And yeah, that's really about it. I mean, I could talk for 3 hours about this and about Thomas Paine. As Lynette's mentioned, I'm crowdfunding the project. One of the things that makes me really identify with Paine is how difficult he found it to get his work published at the time. One of his books was half printed until the printer was approached by the government and suddenly realized he was printing something subversive. And Paine had to go and collect the half-printed copies and try and find a new publisher. I could not find a publisher for Tom Paine's Bones. I think they're fools, and I think the agents who are the gatekeepers of people like Penguin are idiots who pretend that they know what the next Harry Potter is going to be. But yeah, I've been put in a position of having to crowdfund this. I've done it before for other books and feel quite confident about it. And I think Paine would have really recognized that sometimes you just have to get down the printer yourself with a cart and get things sorted out. So we're launching, it says here 1st of February, but I've changed that slightly to the 9th of February, partly because it was a last minute glitch with the crowdfunder people doing ID checks, but partly because 9th of February is Paine's birthday. And I thought, what better a time to launch a crowdfunder to pay for the book than then. So I really, really hope it's something that you feel you can support, not just financially. Publicity for the project is gold dust. So if you are able to let people know about it, it launches on the 9th of February. It runs for 30 days, and we've got a target of £15,000, which I think is very doable. We raised 12,000 for Peterloo, my previous book, 13,000, sorry, for Peterloo. So yeah, feeling very confident, but this will very much need to be a group effort. And I really hope you'll support it. And I'm very grateful to Working Class Movement Library for their support to date and for letting me do this talk. And now let's have some challenging questions. Thanks very much.
Brilliant. Thank you very much indeed. You are getting a lot of virtual applause there. If you can see, if you're on gallery view, there is a lot of virtual applause. And I would encourage people, while applauding, to be thinking of questions or comments, or while opening your checkbooks, obviously, for the crowdfunder. But yeah, if you want to put a question in the chat, you're very welcome to. I would also keep an eye out if you prefer to do it with me unmuting you. There are a lot of us here. We got to 100, which is fantastic. So if I miss you out, then do please put something in the chat. But does anyone want to wave at me? There was okay, Gordon. I'll come to you in a sec. There was a question in the middle, Paul, which was: is Thomas Wright of Derby linked to Joseph Wright of Derby?
I'm not aware of it. No. Because I mean, Joseph Wright was a relatively wealthy person, wasn't he? I mean, he was an iron worker. Is that right?
No. Joseph was a scientist, an astronomer, a gentleman astronomer in a gentleman's group of scientists, and also a painter. And he did a lot on studies of the moon and of the quality of light.
I wonder perhaps if I'm getting the two names muddled up. And where was Joseph Wright from?
Derby.
It could be that I'm simply getting the names muddled up. It was
and Joseph Wright of Derby. His name is always used to separate him from Joseph Wright of Philadelphia, who was an entirely different character.
Okay, I mean the astronomer I'm referring to was very much from working class roots. You know, he was self-educated. I don't know if that's the same person.
No. Joseph was a gentleman.
Oh, right.
And these scientific meetings took place in his home library, and he did the air pump, that famous image of the vacuum tube with the bird struggling for air. That's Joseph. He painted it.
I know who you're talking about now. Yeah, no, they are separate people, and I'm not aware of any links between them. No.
Okay.
Somebody's just asked about the nature of crowdfunding.
Yes, go on. Yeah. Tell us a bit more, because somebody else has asked about can they buy to check. So tell us how the crowdfunder actually works.
Right. So there's different ways crowdfunders can work. Some of them are open, and you just raise as much money as you raise. But the one I'm using, Kickstarter, has a target of 15,000, and you either make that or you don't. And basically, I've set that you can go above it. You know, like you could end up with 500% of your target, but essentially people pledge their money, but the money only comes out of your bank account if we hit the target, and then in return there are various stages of pledges. So there are some that are just like, say, £10, where you're just giving the £10 in solidarity. There are at 25 quid you can actually get the book. And then there are various kind of badges and bookmarkers and then artwork from the book that get offered for the higher funding bids. But one of the really unusual things I'm going to do with my crowdfunder is if you give £10 or more, you'll have what I'm calling editorial access. I very, very much want to run ideas past the people who are funding the book. And see what you think, and see whether you feel some of the experimental images are a bit too much, and so on and so forth. So you're not just buying the book, you're becoming part of the team that actually decides what goes in and what doesn't.
It was wonderful on Peterloo getting all the updates coming through. I really, really enjoyed all those emails. It was ace.
Actually, the big difference this time is I don't have the sledgehammer of the 200th anniversary poised over my head. That was the worst thing about Peterloo. It was such hard work getting it done on time. It was really unpleasant. This will be a bit more leisurely, I hope.
So the link to the crowdfunder will go live on the 9th of February.
Absolutely. But in the meantime, there are 2 social media pages I've set up, a Facebook page and a Twitter page. So if you just want to instantaneously find out when the actual crowdfunder link is live, then best thing to do is sign up.
Yeah, I've stuck both of those links into the chat, so you can grab those people. What I will also do on the 9th of February, the day it goes live, the event page for this website will stay on our event page with a link to the YouTube recording, and I'll also put a link to the crowdfunder when it comes live. It won't stay there indefinitely, but it will be there at the start. So that's another way, if you're not on social media, that you'll be able to link through to the crowdfunder. Okay, we've got a few people with their hands up now. Gordon was the first, but I think he's just stepped away. So Valerie, you were the next. Valerie?
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me? Yes?
Yeah.
Yep.
Good. Well, I see he's a gentleman. He dresses like a gentleman. He travels all over the world, but his books are never quite finished or sold. How did he fund all that traveling and so on? And 2 wives and all this?
Yeah, indeed. Well, as a result of his second separation, he could have taken absolutely everything, but he decided to leave his wife with quite a lot. But she also gave him a lump sum of money, which funded his movement to America. Once he was in America, he worked for a local Philadelphia newspaper and was gaining some wage from that. But then when he wrote Common Sense, it exploded. I mean, it just became this massive bestseller. Really hard. It was, if you recalculate sales according to the population of the world or the population of the country, it's right up there with anything that's been published in the last 15 years.
Thank you. That's good. Thank you.
But he gave the money to Washington's army. He partly... One of the most beautiful things he said is, I am a farmer of ideas, and all the crops I raise, I give away. I think that's just such an amazing quote. So partly for political reasons, he didn't try and make massive profits, but also he didn't want to copyright his work, because once if somebody else copyrights your work for you, that's a back door for the government to control the publication of it. So if a publisher said, well, yes, I'll publish your book, right, but I want copyright control of it, he always said no. The American government made a gift to him of a farm, which was confiscated from a loyalist who'd been against the revolution. So Paine did get some gifts from the government, but I mean, he did also die in poverty, yeah, he was somebody who wasn't massively interested in making a huge profit from his work.
He really lived hand to mouth, didn't he?
Towards the end, towards the end, it's quite distressing, the last section of the book, but I've managed to find a tweak at the end, which I hope is very uplifting.
Thank you.
Which I'm not going to share for love nor money. You only get to see it if you read the book.
Sheila's asked, could you repeat the quote on monarchy, starting, surely there must be something strangely degenerating in the love of monarchy. I'm afraid I didn't get any more.
I'm afraid I would have to screen share again. I don't have the words in front of me. But when this video is on online, you'll be able to freeze it at that picture, that crazy picture of the Wizard of Oz, and read it then.
Yeah. Or Sheila, just cut and paste the start of that quote into Google, and or DuckDuckGo, or any other search engine you may wish to use. Right, Gordon, you were wanted to. No, you're all right now. Okay. Here, Eleanor and Frank's PC. Do you want to say something? Do you want to unmute?
Did you say me, Annette?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh no, hang on. No, sorry, Frank. It wasn't. It was. But you can do. Now you're on mute. Go for it, Frank. Well, I won't lose you. Go on.
You were talking about Joseph Wright of Derby. I know he's worked quite well. I lived in Derby for 13 years when I worked for the railway, and I've been in the City Art Gallery. His effects of light, I don't even know if you can see this or not, are absolutely fantastic, and the author Polyp very much reflected that in his cartoons. It probably closed now, but the Derby City Art Galleries are a hidden gem. They have this whole gallery devoted to him, and there are the pictures of it. He was a very famous, that's his famous one, the IRA. Can anybody see that?
It's a bit shiny, but yeah, we can get the sense of it. Yeah, again, it's sort of, yeah, it's definitely worth checking out Joseph Wright of Derby. There's an extra. There's another talk there. There's definitely another talk there. Not to mention your mention of sea shanties, Paul. We definitely need a sea shanties talk but that's the thing these days, isn't it?
I've actually got some in the narrative. I mean, it's not just diaries. Some of it is song. Loads of it I didn't mention is going to be, I mean, one of the really big themes in the book is like fake news and vile propaganda that's thrown against political figures. So that's going to feature very heavily in the narrative, all the really nasty things that were said about Paine, some of which are just so absurd that they're funny. I mean, I'm not giving them away. You won't believe one of them. The propaganda can descend to that level. It's just hilarious. But that's what I mentioned earlier about people coming on board the kind of editorial decision-making process. It's really hard to judge whether allowing so many of those voices through in the narrative, people might start believing some of it. So that's one of the things I very much hope people will contribute to and you know, be a kind of a focus group for stuff like that.
Okay, brilliant. Okay, Eleanor and Frank, it's your turn. Go for it.
Hello. Yes, I just wanted to mention that I'm afraid it's not really a question, but to mention that one of the few monuments to Thomas Paine is a bust of him on the facade of the Secular Hall in Leicester.
I didn't know that. Wow. If you're able to send us a picture, I'd really be interested in seeing that. Whereabouts?
Secular Hall, which is on Humberston Gate in Leicester. People always say it's opposite Sainsbury's, but really Sainsbury's is opposite Secular Hall.
If you do join any of the social media, I don't know if you use it, but if you do join either of the groups that I've set up before the actual crowdfunder goes live, I'd love you to post something. It'd be really good if you can pop us a picture. That'd be really appreciated.
Just to add that apparently we believe that Leicester Secular Society is the oldest secular society in the world. Started in, I think it's 1852. And Secular Hall, that Frank's just mentioned, was built in 1881 by local businessmen. And so we're still going, and it would be brilliant if you fancy giving us a talk. We have lectures every week throughout the year.
It's an automatic yes.
Fantastic.
Automatic yes. Any opportunity,
thank you.
Any opportunity to talk about Tom Paine. I'm not like one of the I've been approaching loads of different groups about this, political groups, historical groups, skeptical groups, because Paine was, I consider him to be one of the proto-skeptics of starting to interrogate beliefs according to logic and evidence, you know. But humanists and other groups like that and secularists are very much coming on board because I think he's regarded as a great hero by them. Just totally at random, but one of the things I forgot to say in my talk is I mentioned that Paine's perhaps most famous passage about these are the times that try men's souls, and I mentioned that Reagan had quoted Paine. Paine's a really interesting figure in terms of who is attracted to him. The right wing are quite attracted to Thomas Paine, you know. The Tea Party are one of the few people who made an effort to revive Paine. They had a series of videos with this actor playing him. But unfortunately, they only really knew 2 words of Paine's work, which was common and sense. And this Tea Party actor just basically did these online YouTube rants, going on about Obama, going on about gun laws, going on about welfare, but just tagging common sense onto every sentence. He thought somehow he was being Thomas Paine. So it's fascinating. There's a whole group of people who know very little about him, but see him, they're trying to co-opt him as their political hero. And whilst Paine did say some stuff that can be interpreted as in favor of guns, particularly during the revolution, he did speak against pacifism, which I think is really interesting. But yeah, there is no way that he is a Tea Party MAGA type figure. And it's been really funny on these 2 social media pages I've set up to watch these kind of like MAGA people arrive for a short while, these Trump supporters. And then when they see what Paine's actually like, they suddenly disappear again. So your numbers go up and down according to people's political beliefs. It's been hilarious. But I do want them to read the book. You know, I want people who are outside of my political bubble to become engaged. So it's quite an interesting balancing act, you know.
Oh, that's an interesting one. Yeah, that's another whole topic, isn't it? Okay, Pauline, you said you had a question. Do you want to unmute yourself? Yeah, there you go.
I'm really interested in Tom Paine. I think mainly because of his influence on the Romantics, the English Romantic writers and philosophers, particularly Hazlitt, Leigh Hunt, Keats. He obviously had a huge influence on them, and I think it's interesting that the thing about him saying against organized religion is that so many of the Romantic writers didn't believe in God, or they didn't believe in organized religion, and Keats certainly didn't. I mean, he was really against it. But I just think it's interesting that because he was only slightly kind of older, Paine, he was really just, I think it was 1809 he died.
1809 he died, yeah.
That he must have had such an effect on all those people that came after him.
Well, as I say, I think his influence is almost underground, you know. I mean, nobody bats an eyelid talking about certain political historical figures having massive influences on this group and this group and this group. Paine had that influence, but people just don't know that he did. You know, they're not aware of the fact that there's almost like this kind of ghost operating in the background in a lot of culture and political movements, and it turns out to be Paine. As I say, one of the most beautiful images of his remains being scattered around the world. One of the quotes in the book I have is somebody saying that his bones got turned into buttons. And so like his bones are traveling around the world, because, you know, you used to use bone to make buttons in that era. So all these buttons that are made of him are traveling around the world. You know, that's such a powerful symbol for his cultural and political influence. He's like this kind of hidden figure. I mean, a few people I've pushed this kind of Paine's been forgotten line have been quite cross with me, saying, well, we haven't forgotten him. Yeah, I've obviously annoyed 1 or 2 people by claiming this, but if you look at popular political and historical culture, he's just not there, is he? He's just not within the common understanding. That recent brilliant HBO series about John Adams, one of the lesser known presidents, it's got Jefferson in it, it's got Franklin. There's just no sign of Paine in it. It's really extraordinary. I mean, if Richard Attenborough had made his film about Paine, that would have maybe had a huge influence. There was a script written and everything by Trevor Griffith, who I bet is a playwright a lot of you know. He was largely responsible for the script to Warren Beatty's Reds, which is another, you know, very kind of iconic political film. If that had happened, then maybe we wouldn't be in this situation. But I kind of quite like being in the situation of, I hope as a visual artist, I'm one of the people who can turn the tide and get Paine back into popular recognition. That's really what I hope to do. But again, you know, only with everybody's support through the crowdfunder.
I've put the links again for people to the Facebook and the Twitter account. So I don't have all of your contact details because we just get you to sign up via Zoom rather than mediating it. So you will need to keep an eye out on social media yourselves, or go back to the page where you clicked on today to find out a bit more about it from the 9th of February onwards. There's various things in the chat here which I'll share with you afterwards, Paul. Someone said, have you approached skeptics in the pub? They broadcast weekly talks, all very interesting. I'm going to be talking to Patience in California about songs by the sound of it, which sounds great. Thank you very much, Patience. We're so glad you got up so early. I have, somebody is asking, will you have much about agrarian justice in the graphic novel?
Yeah. I mean, I'm particularly interested in the universal basic income, and I think particularly in the light of one of the most underestimated cultural threats we're going to face is automation. You know, like when robots really start taking over people's jobs, big scale. I think universal basic income is really going to have to come in, and Paine very much did talk about that in Agrarian Justice. There's no way I can cover all of his ideas in a short narrative. It's not going to be a massively long book, partly because I think that can become quite trying, it becomes quite expensive, but also it means that I don't have time to do really luxurious artwork. So I do explore that briefly, but I'll put sources in the back. And one of the things you can do with a crowdfunder is if you raise more money than your original target, all of your unit costs for printing the book and so on and so forth come down. So there's some spare money. And you do what's called a stretch goal. I think one of the stretch goals will be to create a really, really powerful online database of Paine's quotes and quotes about Paine, so that people can explore, you know, like, if you like, the lower half of the iceberg that the book will be. So I really hope that one of our stretch goals, if this really succeeds and goes hundreds % over its target, is we'll do things like that and make sure all that material is available online.
Right, brilliant. Now, I was going to ask a question on behalf of Steve and Amy, but Steve has got his hand up. So, hang on. You're on.
Hi. Yeah, no, fantastic talk. Thank you. The book looks really beautiful and wonderful, and I'm quite excited to have a chance to crowdfund it. So I'll be getting straight onto that after this. But I wanted to ask, there was a TV sort of film back in, it was a series, I think, in the 80s called The Philosophers. And there was one episode that was about a kind of imaginary meeting between Blake and Paine.
I know the one, yeah.
Did you see it? And
Yeah,
it was really wonderful. And it was sort of the kind of classic mystics versus, you know, political activist debate. But it was a really, that was my first kind of encounter with Paine. So I just wondered if you'd seen it. And yeah.
I watched some of it. I was, I mean, I found it quite hard work, to be honest. I'm not a big fan of Blake. I find him very hard to relate to, despite his artistic credentials. But I mean, one of the things that Blake always gets mentioned whenever you mention Paine. It's really funny. He's one of these. He's like Paine's shadow, or vice versa. And one of the stories in the book, another scrape with death, was apparently Blake warned Paine at a political meeting that they were both attending that you need to get out of the country. The government's coming for you, and you're going to be a dead man if you stay in England. So it's really interesting that the two figures keep coming up. You saw earlier I did that image based on American Gothic, where there was quite clearly a visual reference to another piece of artwork, sort of timeless kind of thing. When I do the scene between Blake and Paine, with Blake basically whispering this warning to Paine, I might actually try and render it in Blake's style. It might be quite interesting.
Fantastic. Yeah, that would be great. That'd be beautiful.
I don't want to do this kind of straightforward photorealism again. You know, it's not necessarily that interesting to draw, and it's not necessarily that interesting to look at. So yeah, Blake's going to be in there for definite.
Great, thank you.
More whetting the appetite. Stuart Barlow, you have a question, if you want to unmute yourself.
Thank you, Lynette. Actually, somebody who's actually come to graphic novels sort of late in life through the influence of my son, I must admit, initially. I was just really about your views on why graphic novels seem to be quite powerful to tell, you know, serious political stories. I mean, I've read the one, you know, Mary and Brian Talbot's books on, you know, on the suffragettes and read, you know, the commune and everything. Why do you think, you know, that as a media it actually works really well on this as a sort of? Is that because we've all someone's telling me we've all misunderstood the artwork, you know, the art of the graphic novel, probably, you know, of us of an older age. But I just wonder what your views on that. And the other, just one small thing, you know, where you've got quotes from Tom Paine through the book. Will there be a way of knowing where they came from, whether it's from common sense or, you know, the Age of Reason, what have you?
I don't want to overburden, to take your second question, I don't want to overburden the boxes with too much information about where the quotes are from. I mean, each quote will be very clearly identified by pale grey letters underneath the name. It's the same as the Peterloo book. I'll try and do some kind of sourcing at the back, but I think it's so easy to just type this stuff into a search engine nowadays that you know, the world has become this one massive library, hasn't it? Yeah, I think it's too interrupting of the flow of the book, but we'll see. I mean, with particularly controversial things like that statue image, I think I will put a quote in the back, a little footnote in the back. And then the whole thing about, like, well, you know, what's the influence of graphic novels? I mean, it's a visual generation, isn't it? You know, I don't want to suggest that people have stopped reading, but seeing things can be in some ways, a lot more powerful and simple a visual experience. I mean, one of the things I think can be problematic about graphic novels is that they can be substitute movies. Quite a lot of the ones you read, you can see that the person actually really wanted to make a film. It's obvious from the way that, if you like, the camera work is done. And I don't want to do that, you know. I want it to be that the narrative could be read on its own, without any of the pictures, and still make sense. And then I want the pictures to kind of like make all these kind of puns and allusions and play with what's in your head. And I think that's something you can't do in a film. So, you know, that particularly interests me, that I can use the virtues and strengths and weaknesses of the actual medium to do something that you can't do in a film, and you can't do on the radio, and you can't do on the stage. And so I'm using it in a slightly unusual way. I can't really answer the question of why it appeals. Is it that comic books have been associated with children and adolescents, and now they're coming of age, and there's a nostalgic fondness for them? Is it a more powerful visual medium than the moving image? I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know the answer.
Some things don't. You know,
I mean, all I can say is what I want to do with it is not make a movie, you know. So you saw, say, that image of the two candles when I was talking about Paine approaching death. I think there's lots of novel things you can do with still images that you just can't possibly do in a movie or on stage. So I really hope to exploit that. So that's my feelings about the medium. But traditionally, they're quite linear narratives, aren't they? A lot of them. You know, as I say, the camera follows somebody into a room, they exchange something, and then one person leaves the room. I'm not desperately interested in that as a visual form. But there'll be loads of puns about other cartoonist styles. And so if I do use a period cartoon, like the one of Cobbitt on the dragon, I tend to redraw that so that it feels like a hybrid between my style and an actual photograph of the image, so that the whole thing feels visually consistent all the way through. So I failed to answer your question, I'm sorry.
That was an observation, probably more than a question.
Well, a very, very interesting answer. And we're hearing a lot about the creative process as well as Thomas Paine, which is a really fascinating combination. Has anybody else got anything they want to ask or to comment on? If you want to wave at me, I will just be looking.
In the pause, I'm going to say something in the hope of provoking people. So I talked earlier about like what attracts me to Paine. One of the things I didn't mention is that I don't think he represents any particular political dogma. I talked about how loads of different political groups identify with him, some because they've misunderstood him, so on and so forth. But I don't see Paine as a figure of the left or of the right. I see him as very much a free thinker. And I think that's a really important political theme today, where things are becoming increasingly polarized and people are not necessarily basing their views on the evidence. They're basing their views on exclusively how they feel. And I think Paine, represents a break from that. And so, I don't see him as just a historical figure who we can look back on and, oh, isn't it nice that those are the roots of our ideas? I think he's somebody who's got something useful to say about the present day in terms of his overall view. I was looking at one of his quotes about one of the things that's most important about freedom of speech is that it allows people to change their minds. He said that if you don't allow others to have opinions that dissent from yours, you're depriving yourself of the opportunity of changing your mind. And I think that's a fundamental political message to the current era, where people are no longer really listening to each other's points of view, and people are just squaring off and battling from within their thought bubbles. I think Paine represents a break with that, and I think that makes him a really important figure. Hopefully somebody will disagree now.
Well, yeah, I can see various people who were instrumental in putting together the library's Thomas Paine exhibition, Citizen of the World, which actually is still there, frozen in aspic in the building. I wished I could say to all of you, come and see it tomorrow, but it will be there when we're back able to be open.
I hope you keep it open. I thought it was superb. If the people who are working on it are here, congratulations. I thought that was absolutely brilliant. Fantastic piece of work.
Oh, there you go.
Please
That was worth hanging on for, wasn't it? Ken, Chris, and
keep it
Paula.
open for a few months. Please, can I lobby? Well, please keep it open for another 6 months after COVID. Please, it's great. I'll get people down there. Don't you worry.
Yes, I'm sorry we couldn't get you filming your crowdfunder in there. That would have been lovely. But yeah, we are aiming to. We've closed the books that are in it so that they don't get damaged and they don't get that. But it is all sitting there waiting for people to come to. And I put in the chat the link through to the booklet that accompanies it, because that's full text on our website, and you can therefore read the text of the exhibition boards, which are there waiting for you to come back and have a read of in real life, if you can remember back that far. But yeah, if you head back in the chat and look at that link, because it's yeah, the amount of work that was put in by our volunteer exhibition team for that was amazing. They're all big fans of Thomas Paine, but yeah, there you go. Okay, is anyone want to pick up with what Paul just said, or any other questions? We might be coming to a natural conclusion here. We're getting some more virtual applause. That's always good. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us, from getting up very early in San Francisco to people in Manchester and Salford. It's always a joy to see people. If you're new, then we do hope that you'll come back and want to find out more. Look on our events page of our website, and you'll see all the talks that are coming up. This is just the start of our 2021 series. Ray, you're waving at me. Do you want to unmute yourself?
I'm sorry, I missed the, I'm really, really sorry. I missed the early part, but I just think it's wonderful what you're doing, Polyp. But I just wanted to ask you if, and you may have mentioned this, but if you reference anywhere Paine's connection to the Quakers.
Yeah, I do, yeah.
Because he, to my mind, as he was about politics, he was about religion. So although he was influenced by the Quakers, he didn't align himself with them so much. It was the same, what's the word, freedom of attitude that he had.
Yeah, no, I mean, the Quakers come up several times in the narrative. I mean, obviously because of his upbringing, with his dad being a Quaker, and he was very conscious, I think, that he was disappointing his father in some ways. He says a lot of critical things about the Quakers, but he really reminds me of a Quaker. I mean, if I had to, in one of the interviews I did, I talked about his religious views, which for me, as I said earlier that I don't want to control the narrative. I don't want to filter the experience for people. As a fairly militant atheist, that would be easy for me to do, and I'm not going to. But it's quite an interesting personal challenge to fairly represent his religious views, whilst at the same time emphasizing what lots of atheists like about Paine, which was the way he talked about the church. Obviously, there's the thing about the Quakers refusing to have him in their burial ground. That's another.
Yeah, that was terrible.
It was.
Shameful part of Quaker history.
Yeah, I mean, well, the Quakers came up in my Peterloo narrative as well. I'm sure you realise the Quaker meeting house in Manchester, where I'm based, was a really central central thing to that story.
Yes.
But yeah, no, I'm not going to misrepresent his religious views to the point where I anticipate quite a few of my atheist friends getting annoyed with me. I can hear one of them.
He obviously took from the Quakers what he wanted, didn't he?
Yeah.
And set aside what he didn't want. But he, as you say, I think the Quaker upbringing did have an effect on him. Yeah, his way of thinking.
I think he'd either be a Quaker or a Unitarian if he was around these days.
Yes, probably.
Or post Darwin, would he have become an atheist? It's really interesting.
He might have. Yes.
But I mean, you know, part of what I find fascinating about his religious belief was it was based in his understanding of science. You know,
that's right. Yes.
I mean, I am exercising some editorial control in terms of that I'm going to emphasize things that are interesting to me. I'm not going to exclude anything, but I'm going to spend more time in the narrative talking about things that appeal to me, and the way in which he felt that a knowledge of the universe around us is what he felt was a god, a deist god manifesting stuff. I think is quite beautiful. A lot of you know, you can even get Dawkins and people like that to admit to this kind of sense of awe and wonder about the universe around us. And you know, yeah, that's one of the things that warms my heart about Paine as a figure. He
always warms my heart.
His love.
You know, I'm just staggered that in this country, everybody will have said this, we have no major monument to him or anything, and outside Parliament we have Cromwell and full people.
And
not Paine. Paine should be outside Parliament.
No cultural recognition of him either.
No, not at all. No.
But we're going to change that. We'll change that together.
Yeah, you are.
We did it for Peterloo. We're going to do it for Thomas Paine.
Yes, we are. Well done.
Well, that is. I mean, we as I say, we got up to 100 people. We've still got 60 on, which is brilliant. On the principle of leaving and wanting more, I am going to be drawing this to a close, but it will be up on our YouTube channel. So if you joined late, don't worry. You can catch up with what you missed, or you can rerun it, or you can let your friends know, because there will be people who were locked out of it since we reached our 100 maximum. So yeah, do please tell the world. Paul, we're really grateful to you. That's been an absolutely fascinating look at a figure who was a great hero to our founders. As I said at the beginning, Ruth and Eddie, has been very important in the history of the library. We've got a fantastic Paine collection, which isn't as well used as it could be, despite the best efforts of our exhibition team. They've used it extensively, of course, but we want people to use it. So have a look at our website, come back and see us when you can. And in the meantime, please follow the links through and be aware of Paul's crowdfunder, which is going to be going live on Paine's birthday on the 9th of February. So we wish you all the very, very best with that. Thanks everybody for your involvement. So next week, on Wednesday the 10th of February, we'll be celebrating LGBT plus History Month, with Ray Wolford talking to us about Scottish activist Kath Duncan, who was involved at the highest level in campaigns such as the 1920s hunger marches and the fight against Oswald Mosley's fascists, but has since been airbrushed out of history. And a reminder that this talk has been recorded, will be uploaded to our YouTube channel shortly, and that's youtube.com/WCM Library. And a final reminder that our talks are, as usual, free. However, we would like to encourage you to support the library if you're able to do so. And there is a donate button on our website. Thanks again and goodbye until the same time next week. Take care, in solidarity, with very best wishes from all at the Working Class Movement Library. Goodbye.
Thank you very much. Cheers, folks. Thanks for being here.